You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host. You know who I am, Goku. Here to bring another discussion around a paper today. We're talking about is African science true science? Reflections on the methods of African science. Before we begin, I want to remind you guys that this podcast is a part of a podcast network. There are other shows on the network I think you should be tuned into as well.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Also check out the Queen's Council podcast and keep up with KWAZ Radio's YouTube channel. We got some new shows coming as promised earlier in the year. We have some new shows coming. You guys should tune in to that channel. Make sure to subscribe to that channel so that you will know when the new shows are coming to the podcast network. Quick look in the chat room, and I see there's a whole bunch going on. I appreciate you guys being in the chat room. Everyday NYC1 is new here, saying greetings. It is my first show. Kevin Care 42 sent me here. Black Strong. Thanks to Kevin Carre 42. I was saying Kevin Care 42, but it's Carre. So thanks for Kevin Carre 42 for sending folks along. Kevin Carre 42 is here saying greetings, health, wealth, relationships, and abundance to all. NYC Beauties is here saying Black first and always. Appreciate it. NYC Sports Archive says melanated excellence. Agreed. Sankofa Knowledge says bring that hot fire tonight. Black first. Black Excellence says sorry I'm late, but here nonetheless. And Revolutionary Matron is in the room saying greetings. Greetings to Revolutionary Matron. Thanks for all of you being here tonight. Much appreciated. So yeah, so let's get into tonight's paper. Right, in the last paper I did, I talked about and we discussed the notion of African medicine. And like I told you guys, for that paper, I came across that while I was doing research for something else. Similarly, came across this paper that ties into the thing I was doing research for. This paper, I wanted to kind of look at the African version of the scientific method. So in reading this paper, we should be able to understand how Africans traditionally viewed the steps towards scientific inquiry or scientific discovery, right? The way they went about it. So let's see how it differs to what Westerners do. All right. Let me find the paper. Hold on. So, is African science true science? Reflections on the methods of African science. This paper is by Oseni Taiwo AFISI, who's a Ph.D. in Lagos State University. The abstract reads, the general character of science and the methodology it employs are in specific terms referred to as observation and experimentation. These two methodologies reflect how science differs from other systemic modes of inquiries. This description characterizes strictly Western science, and it is contrasted with the indigenous mode of inquiry that has come under the name African science. In contemporary scholarship, African science is being condemned to the level of the mystico-religious or supernaturalist worldview. African science is said to be purely esoteric, personal, and devoid of elements of objectivity and rigorous theorization. In this paper, I re-examine this recondite issue by further reflecting and strengthening some of the ideas put forward by some African scholars to affirm that there is a distinct method of African science that can be termed scientific. In defending a pluralist thesis toward knowledge, scientific inclusive, this paper posits that there exist varieties of inquiry beyond what has been developed in the West, which can still be justifiably termed scientific. In addition to pluralism, it argues further that the social character of science, which makes it a part of social and cultural traditions, qualifiedly justifies African science as a true science. I will employ the newly formulated conversational method endorsed by the conversational school of philosophy in this inquiry. And here we see what the keywords to this paper are, right? It's important to understand how our ancestors went about scientific inquiry, right? Like Kevin Carre 42 says here, when they cannot figure out your techniques, they try to destroy you. They try to undermine it. They try to take away its value, right? The European knows that the way to go is to always try to devalue other people's systems and make it seem that their system is more valuable. This is why you have folks who cling to the concept of America over the concept that their ancestry comes from Africa, because they've been led to believe that USA is greater, Africa is lesser, right? But we also want to understand this African technique of how they go about carrying out science, because again, we have the project of curriculum. We want to be able to incorporate as much as we can that we know of our traditional ways into our curriculum. So we want to see what is it that we need to be focusing on when we teach our young learners and even adult learners how to go about, right, with scientific inquiry. So the introduction says, in his book, Consilience, E.O. Wilson describes the nature of science as the organized systemic enterprise that gathers knowledge about the world and condenses the knowledge into testable laws and principles. This view sees science as the concerted human effort to have a clear understanding of the history of the natural world and how the natural world works, with observable physical evidence as the basis of that understanding. This description represents the general character and nature of science, as well as what can be termed scientific in a broad sense. If what the scientist does is to understand the cosmos through observable evidence in order to appropriate technical and rational solution to it, then this is an approach that can be significantly found in every rational and intellectually open society. Such an explanation simply bourgeons into a pluralism in science that extinguishes the idea of a single self-consistent mode of rationality that could be universalized. A universalism of science would deny the impressiveness of plurality in science. Point being stressed is that an attempt at globalizing science, in particular, through the viewpoint of Western science, would impress upon other non-Western societies the particular yardstick for measuring what is scientific. Such an attempt would obscure the need to recognize that there exist other systematic indigenous approaches to science, different from Western science, that maintain significant indigenous methods of inquiry of their own. That's an important point. When one of our science, well, take me, I was a science student, right? I am the product of being a science student, right? And we follow the steps of scientific inquiry, and it rarely allows, or it only to a certain extent allows, like real creativity. It doesn't really take into consideration the way you think, the way people solve problems in your culture, etc. It's just this white-faced, 6-step process, right, that we just follow. And then these folks will wonder why there's so much fraud or fraudulent behavior in scientific outcomes, in reported scientific outcomes. The accomplishments that different cultures all over the world have attained in the thousands of years that people have lived in various societies only confirm that systematic indigenous knowledge is wrapped around rational inquiries about the natural world. The criteria for what passes as a standard of rational inquiry in Western science cannot be used as a parameter of what can pass muster as knowledge in other cultures, as experiences, values, history, and politics differ from one culture to the other. The values and potentials of pluralistic paradigm of science is that it takes into account local knowledge and practices of a particular environment and its people with a view to distilling systemic indigenous knowledge and its methodologies. That is nothing but a word, right? What's the point of coming from a society to only adopt someone else's outlook on how to approach knowledge? In the chat room, Kevin Carre 42 says, when they cannot figure out your techniques, they try to destroy you. He says, remember, they faked a fossil called Piltdown Man. Right, here's the article. You guys can click the article in the chat and check that out. NYC Sports Archive says, to this day, they cannot figure out how our ancestors built the pyramids. NYC Beauty says, plenty, if not all their science are frauds. Yep, that's just what I said, right? If Elon Musk can be a private scientist, so can our people. It does not take money. You see what Black Excellence just said right there? Absolutely true. Listen, I don't know if you guys know this. There used to be a magazine. I don't know if they still make it. I think I have it on the Discord, or if I don't, I have it on a thumb drive ready to put on the Discord. It's called Make Magazine. I used to be a big fan of Make Magazine. Make Magazine has articles from citizen science. Citizen scientists that shows you that there's people out here who are doing their own science, man. Now, they're probably following the same Western scientific inquiry, right? But like Black Excellence just said, you, me, all of us could be citizen scientists, and that's something that we got to really take into credit. Everyday NYC says tired of their system. Absolutely. Black Excellence says to me, I credit you with the Elon Musk comment. Well, I appreciate that. If this dude could send rockets up to space, you telling me we don't have no African in the world, no African industrialists around the world who can also put the right people together and send some rockets up into space? Come on. And I get it. We have problems here on Earth. But the thing that you gotta look at these other folks, and you have to applaud them for, they're constantly pushing the borders. They have folks here suffering too, but they're still going up in space. They're still trying to be, they're still trying to be the next space explorers and space colonizers. And we are just sitting down here watching them do it. And then we wonder, how is it that we weren't in on this and the other thing, right? You got to be in it. I get that we have people who have problems on Earth, but we got to be in it. You could walk and pat your belly at the same time. You could walk and chew gum at the same time. Right? Revolutionary Matron says we have to stop acting from a position of lack and tap into the inner power. Absolutely. Absolutely. Moving forward. It is this motivation which underlies the work of some African scholars, such as Chris Akpan, Jonathan Shimakona, as well as Christian Emadolo. By the way, these names it reflect exactly what we talked about during the African names and impact on Pan-Africanism. I mean, look at these names: Chris Akpan, Jonathan Shimakona, Christian Emadulu. I mean, come on. On structure and methods of African science. So these are people to highlight. These are folks you need to look into. Their ideas draw support from more recent works in African thought, particularly from the works of Ivan van Sertima's Blacks in Science, Ancient and Modern from 1984, which details examples of scholars' accounts on African science and on the countless number of contributions that African civilizations have made to science on the continent and beyond. Akpan and Emadulu respectively buttress the argument that there is no one universal method of doing science, and that every science esteems the idea that knowledge is part of social and cultural traditions. As such, scientific ideas are developed, advanced, and affected by socio-cultural and historical orientation. I mean, think about what we've done before we encountered the Yurugu, right? Before we encountered Wazungu, we had done a bunch of stuff. We didn't have their scientific, their steps of scientific inquiry, but we still made some shit happen. Again, like I mentioned the other day, man, I've been rereading of late because I'm writing this short story. By the way, the first prompt in our creative corner is on the Discord, and we have a short story prompt that we're working on. And I've been, the story that I'm writing is steeped in some truths, and is based on some truths, and some of those truths I want the story to be based on is in the book Before Egypt, the Baja Confederation, Africa's First Civilization, which is a poorly edited, poorly edited and poorly formatted book, but it has a lot of knowledge in it that shows that African folks, before meeting any European, right, was doing the work and was getting things done and discovering and building upon discoveries, etc. Right? In the chat room, I see we got Life with Nelly joins us. Thank you. Good evening, Life with Nelly. Kevin Carre 42 says, I used to be intimidated about being a publisher, but once I put my mind to it, I got things done. Absolutely. Kevin Carre 42 says to Revolutionary Matron, as you said to me, we have abundance in ourselves. Right? We have abundance in ourselves. That's why they always come to us. We are the universe, ever expanding, ever vast and infinite. Right? KW Don 7 is in the room. Peace to KW Don 7 and all of you guys who are here live with me tonight. I appreciate it. All right. Let's continue though. ACPAN categorized African science into two classes: traditional African science and modernized African science. As with their counterparts in the West, traditional African scientists, according to ACPAN, are interested in the inquiry about understanding the nature of reality. However, unlike Western science, which distinctly separates science from technology as independent fields of human endeavor, traditional African science stands out in its ability to combine the inquiries into the nature of the cosmos with the application of such knowledge into technicalities. African traditional scientists are regarded as scientists and technologists at the same time, right? So if you want more information, I mean, ACPAN will be a good person to read up on. For ACPAN, the modernized African scientist uses a hybrid of traditional African scientific method and the method of modern Western science. The modernized African scientist incorporates the techniques of Western science, like using scientific instruments such as microscope, telescope, stethoscope, right, etc., in his experimentations. He may even have traditional laboratories. The products may be standardized. Some modernized African scientists, in spite of their formal training, still employ some aspects of traditional African culture when engaging in their activities. Similarly, Shimakonam puts forward an approach which is aimed at systematization of African science. This systematization is a rigorous consideration of the various transition that the method of African science have continued to witness. Right? Chimakonam enumerates 5 methods that capture African science beyond ACPAN's descriptive level to the level of systemization and experimental science. These methods include, according to him, Ako Inwale, trial and error, Ako Ijuase, interscience, Ako Ime Obi, intro science, Ako Naironwi, SEM science, and Ako Enso and Azu, causal science. Now I probably butchered the pronunciations there, but you know, you get it. Right? So basically, this author that they're referencing has broken down African science into trial and error, interscience, right, going between different sciences, intro science, going deeper into a science, SEM science, and causal science, right? So that's something to keep an eye and an ear on, right? And Madulu's attempt to forge a new paradigm in African experimental science consolidates on the systemization approach of Chimakonam. Emadulu's supposition is that African experimental science must be relishable on the inherent natural magical tradition that pervades the cultures of the people of the continent. His reason is simply because European science itself emerged out of its own magical tradition. Is there any lies being told there? Is European science not out of its own magical tradition? That's interesting. Consequent upon the above characterization, central to this paper is the issue of whether there exists a method or methods of African science that can truly be termed scientific. This paper focuses on discussing only issues concerning the methods of traditional African science. It is aimed at establishing the thesis that every systematic indigenous knowledge or scientific inquiry reflects cultural differences. My outlook in this paper will seem controvertible in the eyes of many who believe that cultural differences cannot be determinative of good science. My argument is that there is a socio-cultural character to the development of science. This is to the extent that the methods of inquiry in science and the views that its practitioners will adopt concerning their subject matter are significantly a function of culture and of a cultural history that will be unique to a time and place. In this essay, I will engage with some African scholars on the reality of African science, its methods and justifications, in order to open new vistas of thought on the subject as suggested above. This is one of the key goals of conversational mode of inquiry, newly formulated by Chimakonam, right, and promoted by the conversational school in African philosophy. In sum, conversational philosophy or thinking, or the method of conversationalism, is a procedure that is interested in continuous questions and answers that lead to revision of ideas. As Chimakonam puts it, by conversational philosophy, we mean a rigorous and critical philosophical engagement between individual thinkers with one another on phenomenological issues of concern, or on one another's thoughts, where the opponent contests and the proponent defends the viability of such thoughts. In African philosophy, conversational philosophy may prioritize the issues concerning Africa. On the whole, it is a rigorous intellectual encounter between two sides called conversationalists. The one called NY Jew, or the inquirer, who poses critical and confrontational questions to the other on the other's thoughts, and NY Insa, or the responder, who attempts to answer such questions either proposed to him or to another or to all. I suppose, therefore, that in following this method of inquiry in this paper, I will be the NY and Jew, while the various scholars I shall engage will be the NY and Sa. In the end, my goal will be to attempt to open new vistas of thought on the subject of African science. That brings us to a section called The Nature and Methodology of Science. Philosophers of science in the Western philosophical tradition, such as the logical positivists of the Vienna Circle, as well as Karl Popper, have theorized about the nature of scientific methodology. The logical positivists had earlier used the verification principle to demarcate science from non-science. They sought to explain the difference between science and non-science by reference to the idea that science alone is meaningful, that meaningfulness consists in verifiability, and that science is steadfast in its orientation to empirical verification. In contrast to the logical positivists, Popper emphasized the negative idea of falsification as hallmark of scientific thinking. Popper believed that the logical positivists were mistaken when they conflated two quite different philosophical problems, the problem of meaning and the problem of demarcation. They had used their verification principle as a solution to both the problem of meaning and the problem of demarcation. For Popper, falsificationism is the thesis that a hypothesis can be termed scientific only if it has the potential to be refuted. A theory is scientific only if it's falsifiable. Popper thus used falsification as a criterion for demarcation to distinguish the true scientific attitude from the unscientific. The true scientific attitude, according to Popper, is witnessed in Newton's theory of gravitation, as well as Einstein's theories of relativity. In Popper's view, this true scientific attitude differs from what Marxists have toward their Marxism, or by Freudians toward their psychoanalysis, or by Adler towards his individual psychology. For by their attitude, these various thinkers render what they espouse immune from potential falsification. They are dogmatic rather than critical, so what they offer is mere pseudoscience. Hope you guys are following that, right? I hope you guys are following what that what that was saying. All right. Clearly, a typical Western philosophical tradition would denounce any viable methodology for science with embedded metaphysics. In fact, the logical positivists had used their verificationist criterion of meaningfulness chiefly to attack metaphysics as meaningless in acquiring any kind of knowledge. Although Popper regards metaphysics as uncritical, which cannot pass in the realm of falsification, he does not regard it as meaningless. Metaphysics is pseudoscience, but it may have significant relevance to the growth of science. How do you guys feel about metaphysics in general? Do you think metaphysics is pseudoscience? In your daily life, do you think metaphysics is pseudoscience? Right? Reminder that metaphysics is a branch of philosophy that deals with the first principles of things, including abstract concepts such as being, knowing, substance, cause, identity, time, and space. Do you consider that pseudoscience? You know? I see there's some activity in the chat. I'll be with you guys in a second. Let me get to this section. Popper held that even though falsification is a single specifiable method which can be taken as a procedural criteria for all the sciences, there can be non-scientific metaphysical inquiry that later emerges as a mode of scientific inquiry. We are not to condemn the metaphysical outlook in science, for that might have been a necessary step to get a new science going. A consideration of the above two positions, that is, the logical positivists on the one hand and Popper on the other, the methodology of what is to do good science rests only on verificationism and falsificationism, respectively. Although their procedures differ on the specific road to the progress of science, what is common to both is the agreement that the scientific method of inquiry is based on empirical evidence that is predicated on some scientific principles of reasoning. So that brings us to a section called Is There an African Science? Let me hit back to the chat room though. In the chat room, let me go back. NYC Beauty says we are too busy in tunnel vision instead of looking at the vast possibilities around us. Kevin Carre 42 says, I learned how to brew soda, beer, and wine with 3 to 4 basic ingredients. We as African people have great minds, and it's being watered down by outsiders. We must push past that. Sankofa Knowledge says, just like the kid that read a book and learned how to give his village electricity, we can do it too, right? Everyday NYC 1 says there's nothing our people cannot do. Many of us must get past the lazy and drama mentality and more into knowledge-based thinking. I agree with that. Daily Affirmations by Pauline is here saying good evening to you. I still haven't gotten those t-shirts back from the company yet. As soon as I do, you'll get your t-shirt. You and Dorico Cooper Photography. The Pro-Black Perspective is here. Pro-Black Perspective says, sounds like this is going to be good. I appreciate you being here and I appreciate your anticipation. Black Excellence says, yes, stay away from the propaganda of the Muzungus and get the work done. Limit social media intake and your mind will expand. Teetums is here. Teetums says, what's up? At the end of the last episode, I think I shouted out Teetums. I had asked a question and Teetums never answered. I guess Teetums had left before the show was over. But anyway, thanks for being here today, Teetums. Kevin Carre 42 says, no pragmatism in their science, just propaganda. Revolutionary Matron says, Dr. Edwin Nichols would say they cannot count and measure our science, so it's not real to them. I think that psychology is pseudoscience. metaphysics is all of science. I like that answer. How many of you agree with Revolutionary Matron there? Psychology is pseudoscience. Metaphysics is all of science. I think there's something to psychology. But when it gets into that, you want to sleep with your mother type shit, that, you know, that's just goofy. Kevin Ray 42 says, if there is no African science, we would not survive. He says, ScrewTube is censoring again. Yeah, this platform, man, has been censoring like crazy. Sometimes, like I've said before, folks would write a comment after the show is done in the comment section, and I'll see it, or I'll see some of it or most of it on my phone. But when I go to try respond to it, it's been censored. It's gone. You know, this is why I invite you guys, if you haven't already, join the Discord. Your question and comments won't be censored on the Discord. Join the Discord, drop your comments or questions or what have you, and we can communicate that way. Also, I want to say thank you guys for being here. There's a lot of, for this small platform, there's a lot of viewers right now. Let's try to get the likes to match the viewers. Right, let's try to get the likes to match the views, like Kevin Carre 42 just said. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. Help this channel, this small channel, to grow, right? You know, be sure to share it, right, to your socials when you can. Right, share the episodes when you can to your socials. Right? So this brings us to a section: is there an African science? Much like the historical and intellectual debate on the existence of African philosophy, the existence of a distinct African science with its specialized method or methods has also been a subject of debate. One of many denialists of the existence of African science is Samuel Tunde Baja. 1980, Baja published a monograph entitled African Science, Fact or Fiction, wherein he argues against the notion of the existence of an African science. His assertion is that, quote, there is science in Africa, but there's no African science. Oh boy. Contrary to Baja, a profound assertion on the existence of African science can be found in Brian Murfin's 1992 article entitled African Science in School Curriculum. Murfin unequivocally responded that there is African science, and its existence is what calls for the activities, the nature of understanding, and explanations of the phenomena that occur in Africa. So just as science exists in other parts of the world, there is also African science where efforts are made by traditional thinkers in Africa through their years of training and attempts to unfold the truth in nature. This is further buttressed by Nwankwo Easy Basili's position that the African has an authentic scientific culture. Right? When you come across folks saying things like this, you gotta highlight that. You gotta look them up and see what else they're dealing with. What else have they been talking about? Accordingly, African science is African account of nature and how it works. Apparently, this debate on whether there is African science or not continued for some time until Shimokonum in 2012 first attempted a broad-based system in African science. Following from the above, a thesis has been established that there exists a pluralism in science, where inquiries are made in every systematic indigenous culture on how to explain the nature of the universe. The methodology that is employed in African science, for instance, is distinctively unique to the cultural orientation of the people. Right? Absolutely agree. All right? This may change over time as culture evolves. And that's the thing with like the scientific inquiry of the West. It doesn't change. It's been the same before me during my time here, and it'll probably likely be the same after I'm gone. They think they have it all figured out. They have all the steps figured out that you need to understand something. And that just cannot be true, right? However, we have to compare the nature and methodology of African science with what exists as the methodology of scientific research in Western science. We may not come to much agreement regarding what is truly the acceptable methodology of science. Such comparison would foster a certain level of competition, as each indigenous system of inquiry is required to conduct its science through any methodology that suits its workability and practicality. Thomas Kuhn's incommensurability theory favorably addresses this notion that competing paradigms often lack a common measure because they use different concepts and methods to address different problems. Also, Feyerabend's incommensurability theory supports a pluralism in science which asserts that there exists no single scientific method we could agree to which would ultimately foster criticism or severe testing of theories. For Feyerabend, quote, the events, procedures, and results that constitute the sciences have no common structure. The incommensurability that both Kuhn and Feyerabend advocate is to emphasize, in this sense, that different philosophical or cultural traditions can acquire the knowledge-based system of inquiry indigenous to them and can as well develop or adopt a workable methodological procedure for their scientific research, right? So when you understand this statement right here, right, you would then really understand, right, the necessity to design your own curriculum. If it's true, and it is, but if it's true that, you know, if it's true that the way cultures go about problem solving and figuring out things is just fine for that culture to do it the way that they've always done it, or the way they choose to do it, or what have you, and they could come up with scientific fact, scientific evidence, then why is it then that we would want to go about it in a foreign person's way? Why follow a foreign methodology, right, once you understand that, hey, the way we do things is just as valid? And that's the thing that we need to really start to vibe with much better, right? We have to vibe with that much better, because, again, you're putting your children into a foreign person's paradigm and expecting them to excel when you have your own paradigm, which would be more natural for them to excel in, right? Jerry Wallace is here saying hello all. Revolutionary Matron says acknowledgement of an African science would require an acknowledgement that Africans were the first scientists. There is still a refusal to acknowledge the mystery school role as the university. That's true, right? But that's for them. That is true, but that is for them. We ourselves, and you know, it's really coming to a point where we got to look at the majority of black populations as being anti-African. Black equals African, African equals black, but we got to start looking at most of our people are just anti-African. I expect those people not to acknowledge what we've done. That's a given, right? We should be acknowledging what we've done, and we should continue to work and build upon the foundations that our ancestors, our great ancestors, laid down. Right? Kevin Carey 42 mentions we should do the show on Discord. That's an interesting thought. It's an interesting thought, right? But to continue, incommensurability promotes in a parallel way the requirement of scientific pluralism. It discourages a situation where there exists a globalized, scientifically single, self-consistent, overarching mode of inquiry. Pluralism embellishes one way or another scientific methodology to be open by nuance that is different if the subject matter is different, or if the historical epoch is different, or if the cultural milieu is different, or if different personalities are at work. I want y'all to consider this, right? There is billions of dollars donated yearly, and if we go back to the beginning of the HIV/AIDS issue, no cure, and you got a question: is it the approach? No one asks that question. Is it the approach to this disease, right? Why we have no cure yet, and it's been like, what, has it been at least 30 years now, right? Whereas if our people, for example, had taken their own approach, built upon their own approaches to science, might have had a cure. Right? Something to think about. Scientific pluralism therefore nullifies the idea of a methodological unity in science, which holds that there are universal procedures, laws, or methods that are defining of science and that consequently are applicable to all fields of scientific inquiry, despite the pattern variety in science itself. Scientific pluralism extends this idea to non-Western modes of inquiry. It is within this established thesis of pluralism in science that Chimokonum distinctively points out the fundamental differences between Western science and African science. This is in a bid to establish that each indigenous system of knowledge or inquiry is distinct in nature, features, and character, as each one responds to the challenges within its cosmology. According to Chimokonum, Western science is a body of organized knowledge whose pursuit is tied to the principle of empirical, testable, and demonstrable protocol. African science is a body of organized knowledge concerned with inquiries into all shades of reality in African worldview, supported with rational explanations. Let me read that last thing again. How do you guys feel about this outlook of African science versus what we know and what I just recently read about Western science, or the Western approach to science inquiry? African science is a body of organized knowledge concerned with inquiries into all shades of reality in African worldview, supported with rational explanations. Right? Let me know how you feel about that. Right? The difference is that in the former, scientific enterprise is restricted to a segment of reality, namely the empirical. while in the latter, there is no such restriction. So it's this dogmatic, we can measure this stuff, versus the claim is in African science it's not measurable, right? But what is measurability if you have positive outcomes? This distinction epitomizes the differences, in particular the emphasis on empirical on one hand and non-empirical, beyond empirical methodologies on the other. Western science is restricted to the former, and the latter is employed within the sphere of African science. This brings us to a section called Traditional African Science, Nature, Challenges, and Strengths. In the chat room, Revolutionary Matron says, we have so many Africans that do not believe that we can be that great. They are beaten down by this reality, are in fact anti-African. It's sad but true, right? Black Excellence says corruption. Where did the billions go? He's referring to all this money that's been put up, especially in the beginning, but it's been continuous, like in HIV/AIDS research and cancer research. Like, where's all this money going? And how come we can't really put a dent into this thing, right? What was it called again? Is it Cameron? Let me look that up. Is it Cameron that the Kenyans created? Remember? The Kenyans were said to have come up with a cure for HIV or at least for AIDS. Yeah, it was Cameron. Kemron, the name of a drug which was released in Kenya in 1991 and purported to be highly effective in removing the symptoms of AIDS. When put under international scrutiny, the treatment was seen to perform no better than a placebo. Here's the thing, though. Who's to say that this Cameron wasn't effective? Who's to say that it wasn't just effective for African folks? And that, no, it didn't do much more than be a placebo for European folks. And who's to say that that whole drug wasn't destroyed when it could have been the savior for Africans, right, as opposed to everyone else, right? We gotta think about that stuff too. We gotta think more personalized medicines and, personalized to our people and that kind of thing. We gotta think about that. Kevin Carre 42 says Western science deals with emotion and ego. They cannot stand to see themselves in second or third or fourth, etc. I agree. A pretty monothemes family of dragon tamers. Okay, what a name. A pretty monothemes family of dragon tamers. Okay, says, praise the Holy Father. I just found your channel. I was watching breastfeeding videos of yours, and I happened to catch this live. Okay, I hope the Holy Father is Marcus Garvey or someone, but thanks for being here. I appreciate it. What a name. All right. So let's continue on with this next section, Traditional African Science, Nature, Challenges, and Strengths. In his paper, The Method of African Science, a Philosophical Evaluation, ACPAN, as a matter of fact, I have that paper here too, over here. That's the next paper I'm going to read, actually. The Method of African Science, a Philosophical Evaluation, ACPAN, enumerates a number of methods that characterize traditional African science. He notes that the methods of observation and experimentation, which are hallmarks of every science or systemic indigenous forms of inquiry, also have a significant place in traditional African science. ACPAN, however, avers that the level of sophistication that observation and experimentation have reached in Western science today is higher than what traditional African science presents. The above assertion by Akpan may be correct if we are able to essentially comprehend the advancements in observation and laboratory experiments that have come to characterize Western science today. Indeed, the level of scientific innovations and inventions that Western science epitomizes is significantly impressive. There is really no room for comparing the level of achievements and developments between Western science and traditional African science, except for the purposes of a cross-cultural polylogue, right? The purpose of this polylogue is that when two cultures, for instance, dialogue, ideally people in both cultures learn from their understanding of the other, what can be accepted or jettisoned, and that's an important point. That's kind of what Kevin Kare 42 was saying a second ago. Westerners don't like to be second or third or fourth or what have you, right? So they wouldn't want to have the dialogue, right, with African science, because what if African science is outperforming? They don't want to have the dialogue with African science because they don't think African science is on par with the work that they do. So why listen to a lesser being? That's their thinking, right? Dorico Kubo Photography is here. Peace, family. Peace to Dorico, right? Black Excellence says, look at last year when the people of Madagascar had a T to control the C-19 virus, right? The Rona, right? And that drink was banned from being imported into the United States, right? Think about that stuff, right? We have the opportunity in this world to focus on personalized medicine. A couple of years ago, maybe 10 years ago, personalized medicine was all the rage in Western science, right? Understand the human genome, and if you can understand the human genome, if you can understand the individual's human genome, you could understand what type of diseases they might be susceptible to in the future, this, that, and the other. And Africans need to get on a similar kind of thinking of, understand the African, understand what the African is now susceptible to, right? And start working towards fixing the African. This, again, I talked about this last time, and I've talked about this many times before. This notion that we have black scientists who don't do any work specific to black folks is absolutely nonsense. Forget about the polylogue that they're talking about right now in the paper. Right? Let's have if we're gonna have a polylogue, let's have a polylogue between different African nations within the continent, within the diaspora. Right? Let's become focused on really fixing our own problems. As Kevin Kare just said, think about Jope and melanin at the Egyptology conference. Remember, they didn't want to hear anything Job had to say. Right? Kevin Kare 42 says, one of my former muse is a geneticist. Cool. Right? To continue, this would represent the possibilities of mutual benefit if there is intelligent dialogue concerning the differences and the commonalities. In this way, while traditional African science may not be as burgeoning as to the same extent as that in the West, it yet maintains significant indigenous methods of inquiry of its own. Right? Some people would hear that and say, you see, it takes black folks to save this world. No, it takes black folks to save black folks in this world. Moreover, the gradual pace at which traditional African science can be said to be developing can be looked at from the perspective that the gradual level of development that Western science had to go through right from the ancient Greek period through to the Renaissance and to its current form is indicative of the kind of dialectics that Hegel talked about. at the thesis stage, Western science would be ancient in its raw initial form. It moved beyond the stage of antithesis to the stage of synthesis. As Hegel noted, development is a becoming, and it is non-static. Ultimately, this is the synthesis becomes a new thesis, and the cycle is a continuum. This is the state of development in science. This is also obtainable in traditional African science. Traditional African science is no longer in its ancient thesis stage. The development in trends and methods of traditional African science has evolved significantly over the years to a level of sophistication that can truly be termed scientific. Now, the question I would have there is that, are these different levels that African science has evolved through, are these based on traditional African science or some incorporation of Western science? That would be my big question. Now, that's something I'll look into a little deeper in my research. Well-documented achievements of African scientists can be found in Sertimer's edited book, earlier mentioned, where African science excels in various disciplines of Western categorization of science. The various accounts of scholars in Sertimer's edited work reveals African science contributions in chemistry, in astronomy, on how the Dogon of Mali had an excellent understanding of the solar system, in mathematics, on how the Yorubas had a superbly complex number system based on 20, in biology, in agricultural crop production, and in medicine and surgery. All right? In furtherance of the thesis that African science exists in order to find solutions to some of the fundamental challenges faced within its cosmology, Chimakonam's three-way justification of the African science project defends this assertion. First is the need to develop a science that fits with African native thought system. Second is the need to have an environment-friendly science as an alternative to Western science, which currently presents serious environmental problems. Thirdly is the need for a science that can offer safe and adequate energy to the world. And again, like I've talked about in the past, we can do that, right? These justifications present African science as that which arises out of the utmost need to establish an indigenous brand of African logic embedded within the African thought system. It is a science which is eco-friendly and presents itself as capable of providing safe and adequate energy to the people of Africa. Such a science that its practitioners have shown the capacity for relevance, as African traditional scientists have continued to excel in the various interdisciplinary fields of science, be it orthopedic, soil, crop, and animal sciences, meteorology, astronomy, and medical sciences. Brings us to a section of the paper called Method of African Science. Method of African Science. What I'm going to do here is take a quick station ID break, and I'll read your comments so far that remain in the chat room. I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is BAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Check out those shows, man. Pro-Black Perspective, Harsh Reality Podcast, Queen's Council. You know, when those shows come up and I see a notification that the Harsh Reality Podcast has a new episode of the Queen's Council, I get very happy. Because I know it's a good time. When the Pro-Black Perspective does the Sunday reading of the Book of Power or the Warship or what have you. I know it's going to be good stuff. So you guys should also join in with checking out the good stuff that's also on KWAZ Radio. Make sure to like and subscribe to that YouTube channel as well. Right? In the chat room, Black Excellence says Muzungus are too scared to admit that most, if not all, their science came out of Africa. If they did admit that, it would look like the kid who was caught stealing cookies from the cookie jar. Kevin Carre 42 says the movie The Serpent and the Rainbow is a great example. Thank you for that. You know, make sure you guys hit the like button too. We have more viewers than likes right now. Make sure you hit the like button. It helps with the algorithms, helps for us to be discovered. Like we saw a second ago, we had a new person in the room, a pretty monotheism's family of dragon tamers. So yeah, so, you know, help us, you know, become bigger, right? Kevin Carre 42 says the Haitians found a puffer fish that they powderized. That powder slows down your metabolism to the point of thinking you're dead. That's what they call zombies. Yeah. What was I reading recently? I was reading an article recently. I don't know if you guys saw this, but they wanted to study, what is it again? Is it zebrafish, scuttlefish? They wanted to study one of those model organisms, those aquatic model organisms. I can't remember if it was a zebrafish or scuttlefish or something like that. I know some people who used to do research with scuttlefish. Surprisingly, the brains, parts of the scuttlefish brains are very similar to the human brain. And whatever the aquatic species was, this aquatic species hibernates. And they were studying this type of sleep pattern that this aquatic species has. And they say that in some instances, you can get the human brain to go into this sleep pattern. This sleep pattern is associated with hibernation. Now, what's the whole point of this? The whole point of it is they're saying that if you want to send people through space, you got to remember, you know, like through space to say Mars, for example, you got to remember that in space, the lack of gravity and stuff messes with your muscle composition, messes with your, you know, the whole voyage can mess with your brain. There's radiation higher in space than here on Earth, so you got to think about those things. But the idea is that if you can send the traveler into a hibernation along the lines of what this model organism goes into, right? Again, I can't remember if it's a scuttlefish or a zebrafish or whatever, but if you can do that, you can safely send travelers through space, right? Who wouldn't suffer the effects of space, especially the mental effects of space travel as much, right? Now, again, I'm saying, I said all that to say, where are our people who are coming up with these ideas? Where are our people who are coming up with such ideas? Daily Affirmations by Pauline says, I don't believe metaphysics is pseudoscience. True. Goes on to say, I saw a show years ago where they visited Haiti and demonstrated how the pufferfish powder works. A pretty monotheism's family of dragon tamers says the best science comes from the African Mexican people. Comes from the African, I guess. Mexican people aren't woke like this. I am always in melanated topics. Forgive me, y'all, like fascinated with you. Appreciate the melanin in me. Okay. Okay, cool. Again, I want to thank all of you that are here, man. I see we had a real good number earlier. It's dropped a little bit, but it's still cool. The number of you that are here, who are speaking up in the chat room, who are participating in the discussion, I appreciate you guys. All right, those of you who sit in silence, I appreciate you too. But I wish you would, join in the discussion. It's always fun when everyone gets in on the discussion, right? So this brings us to the section of the paper called Method of African Science. ACPAN identifies one fundamental method of traditional African science. This is the method of causality, with an underlying mythico-religious dimension. In discussing causality as a method of science, ACPAN points to the essential role that causality plays in the nature and character of traditional African science. In his general analysis of causality, ACPAN first simply makes a sweeping generalization of the role of causality in Western science by stating how the Western scientist strives to give a causal explanation to things within the physical universe. ACPAN's intention is to show that causal inevitability of natural phenomena underlies every scientific research. In making a clear distinction on what makes causality in African science different from what is obtainable in the West, ACPAN notes that caution must prevail in not confusing the idea of causal expectations with the idea of causality. He points out that though there are differences in agents of causation, as well as assumptions behind causative patterns, there is no fundamental difference in the idea of causality, whether in the West or in Africa. Causality still simply means A causes B in both contexts, right? A causes B. Essentially, Western philosophers of science are not agreeable on the principle of causality as a method of scientific inquiry. Philosophers such as David Hume, for instance, see causality as a defective system of inquiry. Hume argued that the assumption of cause and effect between two events A and B, say because A causes B, because the two always occur together, we can then conclude that A always causes B, are not necessarily true. Causality to Hume does not guarantee us how experience can give us adequate knowledge. It is this deficiency in causality that gave rise to the problem of induction in philosophy of science. In Hume's criticism of causality, a regular succession of events which necessarily follow one another is impossible to know for certain. This assertion is also true of what has been termed the problem of induction. Induction is regarded as the process of inferring a general law or principle from observation or particular instances. A broader constructual of induction depicts induction as a process where the premises of an inductive argument indicate some degree of support. This broader, I just skipped a piece. Support, right, for the conclusion, but do not entail it. This broader construal of induction suggests that induction imposes elements of probability, which means the certainty of the conclusion is a matter of degree. With Hume, the problem of induction surrounds simply enumerative induction. Such ostensible inferences lead from specific observations to a generalization. Poppers, however, use Hume's skepticism concerning induction more creatively as a basis to dismiss the inference form of enumerative induction. Popper insists that you need to be able to distinguish between good induction and bad induction in order to point to any induction at all. So if Hume shows that there is no such thing as good induction, then the conclusion must be that induction is an empty concept. We need, Popper insisted, a way of thinking about science that is deductivist rather than inductivist. Popper used hypothetical deductivist thinking to account for science. So we see the opposite here, right? What the above clarification on causality signifies is that Western science does have disagreements on the role that causality places in scientific inquiry. Even for the Western scientists who accept causation in science, causality is usually limited to empirical causation, where questions such as what makes A to cause B, or how event B is possible in the face of A, are asked. However, to the traditional African scientists, causality helps to understand the logical richness of generalizations in science. It helps to deepen the understanding of the nature and causes of events beyond the causal empirical explanation of which Western science is limited. The Western scientist is interested in explaining the empirical causation involved in event A, causing event B. The specialist traditional African knowledge inquirer is involved with what Kwame, I think I was told before, this is read as Cheche. Kwame Cheche calls agentive causation, right? The traditional African scientist is interested in the explanation of the cause of an event, a sickness or death. The scientists will tend to raise the questions, who caused it, why was it caused, rather than what and how questions, right? So here's where we finally, for the layperson, we get down to the nitty gritty of what is African science really, right? African science, or African scientists, will ask the questions of who did it, why was it done, right? The Western or the European will ask what and how, right? Which are interesting questions also. What and how is interesting, right? But who and why is really interesting. You feel me? Who and why is a really interesting question, right? Advancing further from Akpan's classification of the method of African science as agentive causation, Chimakonam, in his Towards a Theory of African Science Methods and Justification, attempts a systemization of African science. Chimakonam's systemization of 5 methods in African science is a practical description of the development of traditional experimental science in Africa. These methods include, according to him, I read this before, trial and error, interscience, intro science, SEM science, and causal science. These methods represent the various experimental traditions that characterize African science, right? So now we're going to hear a little bit more about it. Right, the trial and error method articulates how the scientist ventures into designing a project, sometimes without having a clear path to take. This is interesting to me right here, right? This is the trial and error, right? The interscience method is an approach in which there is a non-empirical dimension to the forms of experiment carried out by the scientists, right? So they're not just looking for what's measurable, right? The intrascience employs a mechanical dimension for scientific inquiry, but it is made possible through the functions of the mind. Hopefully they explain that more later. The SEM science method of inquiry is inductive in nature. Right. Again, if you guys ever want these papers to do research of your own, by all means, ask me for it on the Discord, and I'll give it to you. It is characterized by its emphasis on the senses, while at the same time, its outcome is often generalized on the basis of its individual circumstances. Right. The causal science heightens all the other methods of African science. It embraces the idea of agentive causation, but moves further to establish a transcendentalist view of causation. This view considers many other factors on the many causes that can as well produce the same effect. So, as a method of African science, it ensures that the right cause of things is identified to be able to understand the effect it produces. Now, that's an interesting thing. I don't know, I should have asked this question earlier. How many of you live with me right now? Have interacted with the steps of scientific inquiry according to Western science? How many of you have interacted with the steps of scientific inquiry? Right? If you have, you would know that, like in research, for example, right? In research, they do something where, and they think it's helpful, by the way. They do this thing where they have these controlled variables. So you're looking at this phenomenon in a research setting, and you're going to control certain variables, meaning it's going to be, let's say you're looking at plant growth, it's going to be the same amount of light, sunlight for all the plants involved, same amount of water, same amount of soil, same source of the soil. Like you're going to control all these different elements, right? But the reality of a phenomenon that you observe could come from the mixture, so to speak, of a few different elements. So the things that you're limiting or controlling could be actually affecting the outcome that you observe. But in their mindset, it's a sterile environment, so that the outcome you see can be explained by the fact that we controlled all these other factors around the phenomenon that we're here to look at. We controlled all of those things. We kept all those things equal between, subjects in the experiment, in this case, plants. And so the phenomenon you see must be true or false, right? But in this, according to what I'm reading in this African worldview, by limiting or controlling for all these other factors around this phenomenon that you're looking at, you can actually be affecting the phenomenon itself. That's an interesting thing to think about. That's an interesting thing to think about. When I take that thinking back to like research on HIV and AIDS and cancer and all that stuff, you're doing all this controlled work, right? To control all the things around it so that you could just look at the phenomenon, but actually the things around it might be the things that you need to actually be looking at. The things that you're controlling and making equal and in effect sterilizing to a certain degree might be the exact things you need to actually be looking at. A pretty monotheism's family of dragon tamers, what a name, says it reminds me of Thanos because his skin purple. Subliminal message for advanced being. I always felt like Thanos is a representation of the melanated man. Dorico Cooper Photography says, yep, they are sprinkling UFO information, but not telling you there are over 130 ET races that they are aware of, and at least 40 Earth-like planets, right? Well, the Earth-like planets, they do let you know about. I don't know if they tell you it's 40 of them, but we talked about this in a previous episode. They do tell you, if you pay attention, you'll read and realize that there's other Earths. Some of them called super Earths because they're like 7 times our Earth and stuff like that. Kevin Carre 42 says Muzungus have such a limited thinking of things as a whole. Kevin Carre also says I am an artist, very limited scientific experience. Dorico says limited science experience, but very interested in science, especially if I could get around some real science gurus. Black Excellence says, to me, Mzungu's arrogance. There is a coffee plant that grows in a certain region of Jamaica. No amount of laboratory study can make it grow outside of its region. There are nuances. I didn't know about that. I did not know that. All right? But you're right. There are nuances. Right? If you sterilize the environment within this phenomenon that you're looking at, you might be taking out the things that actually make the phenomenon work. You know, so I appreciate what the author is saying at this point in the paper. So with the establishment of causality as a pivotal method of African science, its embedded richness of metaphysics becomes essential. Many Western scientists will consider this erroneous and will inadvertently condemn African science to the level of mysticism, spirituality, or religiosity. However, scholars such as Chimokonam have defended the metaphysical nature of African science. According to him, quote, a science which does not include the metaphysical in its map of reality is surely not African science, end of quote. Others, such as Cheche and Jim Una, have affirmed that the richness of metaphysics and ontological categories of causality in traditional African science is validated. So the condemnation of it is misplaced because it is what gives distinctiveness to the methodology of its science. Both Cheche and Una are assertive and categorical about the positive dimensions of these ontological categories of causality, as they are compatible with the story of harmonious African society. To Una, the African society is a world where everything interpenetrates, where the physical and spiritual conflate. So that's what I'm kind of getting at when I described how they do like scientific experiments, right? Everything is important. When you limit or control certain variables, you might not see the true effect or the true outcome, right? There exists an extraordinary harmony in African society, one of synthetic unity and compatibility among all things. In relation to traditional African science, Cheche also affirmed that the method of traditional African science has significant mystico-religious undertone because traditional African culture is greatly rich in the idea of causality, which is generally understood in terms of spirits and mystical powers. Clearly, such affirmation of a mystical religious orientation in traditional African science is not a negative idea. Rather, it is a strength for which traditional African science remains distinct in its nature and methodology. It signifies its richness in metaphysics and in epistemology as forms of scientific inquiry. This richness embellishes the understanding of a scientific outlook of the world through means beyond empirical causation. So as a method of inquiry, mystical religious consciousness is both spiritual and mystical, although it is much more spiritual and no less literal-minded. The mystical religious inquiry cannot be said to be the complete antithesis of Western science. Truly, one can say that in most non-Western scientific traditions, thinking resonates with the abstract idea of nous, which sees knowledge as the perception of the mental rather than the physical. That is associated with the mystic philosophy of Plotinus. It can also be reiterated that mysticism or religiosity does not necessarily hinder the progress of knowledge, as Western societies were still largely religious while science progressed there. That's a good counter argument to the nonsense, right? So the embrace of the mystical religious mode of inquiry that is associated with traditional African science as a systemic indigenous knowledge of non-Western orientation is quite compatible with the claim that the spiritual is incidental to the physical. This is to the extent that it is believed that the spiritual affects physical phenomena. The spiritual affects physical phenomena. As I observed above, it can categorically be said that religious belief was equally integral to the motivation of much of Western science, which is true, by the way. Who is it? I'm forgetting my science history now. Mendel, if I'm not mistaken, Mendel was a monk, right? Let me double check that before I put that out there. Pretty sure Mendel was a monk. Yes, right. Right? Mendel was a monk, right? So these guys, and a part of what Mendel did was because of how he interpreted religion, right? In the chat room, I see Black Excellence says it's called Blue Mountain Coffee. I've heard of Blue Mountain Coffee before. I didn't know that that can only grow in Jamaica. I didn't know that. Yeah, I know about Blue Mountain Coffee. You know, one of my favorite books, side note, one of my favorite books growing up is a book, I want to say the name of it is either Ascent to Blue Mountain or Escape to Blue Mountain or something like that. But it's a dystopian Jamaica where there's something killing off people. There's some disease or something killing people, and these kids and these Jamaican kids got word that there was a place on top of Blue Mountain that they needed to go to escape the plague. It's a book. I wish I could get my hands on it again. Great book. If you guys know about it, talk about it in the chat room. If you can find it, let me know. Right? It's something like Ascent to Blue Mountain or Escape to Blue Mountain was the title of it, but very good book. As I observed before, it can categorically be said that religious belief was equally integral to the motivation of much of Western science. Western scientists at some point were trying to understand the mechanisms by which God had constructed the world. The way that the religious motivation played out was tied to the early influence of the Greeks, with their literal-minded pursuit of rational understanding. However, this claim does not preclude the fact that science was also at some point in conflict with religious views. A case in point is the ideological conflict that occurred of the Copernican heliocentrism with the Galileo affair against the geocentric model of the Catholic Church. Moreover, the relationship between science and religion since classical antiquity has been controversially characterized as either one of conflict or harmony. Nevertheless, a more qualified claim would affirm that despite these differences, most scientific innovations before the Copernican evolution in the history of science were achieved by societies organized by religious traditions. In all of these, the point being made is that the notions of metaphysics, mysticism, and religiosity, which underlie the method of traditional African science, point to the fact that those notions are significantly compatible with the culture and the history of the people. Granted that Western science have dispatched those notions from the ambience of its methodology, the embrace of a rational justification to objective science is not the signature of Western science alone. There exists no monolithic standard of rationality that can be read out of Western science only. What exists is a pluralistic way of knowing what takes into account both empirical and non-empirical approaches to rationality. So I want to add something to the beginning of this paragraph. for us to create better African scientists, I hope you guys are kind of reading between the lines and understanding that those persons also need to be deeply and fully immersed in traditional African metaphysics, mysticism, and religiosity. Again, this is why curriculum is so important. You have to grab the young learner from early and fully immerse them in the traditional ways of our folks. Because they're going to build upon that tradition, those traditional ways, and they're going to enter into these spaces, the scientific world, bringing along with them and employing, right, these traditional, African notions of metaphysics, mysticism, and religiosity. You see, it's not just one thing. It's not just you can say, I'm African, I'm black, I'm going to start practicing African science. To get to this point, right, you have to start with your African tradition. Else it won't work. You can't be westernized, westernized black or westernized African and just say, hey, I'm going to throw away, Western thought or Western scientific approach and just adopt an African one. You have to be fully immersed first. And that's something you got to keep in mind. That's something we got to work towards. It's not an overnight type of solution, right? To continue. This argument establishes that there are other competing paradigms of rationality aside from what is obtainable in Western science. As such, there is no identity problem foisted on what is known as African science. This suggests that what is regarded as the standard of scientific rationality is something that is specified in each research tradition and epoch. As such, there is no single logic of scientific reasoning that could be specified once and for everyone. Chimakonum's Igbo adage, meaning the firewood found in any nation is what cooks for the natives, buttresses this assertion. What this suggests is that scientific solutions to immediate existential problems require people to look inward for solutions, as problems and solutions are sometimes contextualized to one's social environment. Why can't we get a cure for HIV/AIDS in the continent? This is why. Or this is a part of it. Since the environment to a large extent determines the structure of science, African environment, like its Western counterpart, technically will engender a different science from the point of their ontological and fundamental differences. The indication here is that each one of them will develop technical solutions to the challenges of their peculiar environments. Right? This is all we've been talking about when we've been talking about having black solutions for black problems. Right? This is what we've been talking about. You're not going to solve black problems from a European point of view. This is why things like socialism and all that stuff doesn't really work for us. That's a European point of view. What our leaders need to do, and I've talked about this in previous episodes, they have to come through organizations, particularly educational ones, that prepare them for the position, that immerses them in their Africanness. And they bring that Africanness to solving African problems. That's how we advance. Right? That's how we advance. So this brings us to the conclusion towards a viable, non-empirical, but rigorous method of African science. And I like the term used there. That term rigorous, that's something that we've got to become accustomed to as well. We need to learn how to be serious. Right? We got to become serious. We got to be serious, and we have to be effective in the way we work towards our problems. We have to start using that word rigorous much more when we're talking about fixing our situation. Okay? To continue. You know what? First, let me check in on the chat room. Let me see what the chat room's up to. Black Excellence says the prerequisite is also a deep deprogramming from Western ideals and thought. Absolutely. Absolutely. You cannot take their training, so to speak, and think you're going to fix our problems. Their training are anti-African at its core. Kevin Carre says agreed about looking inward for our problems. Lock out all outsiders, they are not family. NYC Beauty says to Kevin Carre 42, we have to shoo off the vultures and heal ourselves. I mean, closed door policy. We have to have a closed door policy, right? When something's affecting you guys, don't you guys go into your room, into your homes, close the door, and you reflect, you go inward, you try to figure out how to get through it, right? That's the same thing we have to do, right? And we have to do it in African science as well. So in conclusion, a nuanced evaluation of the nature of traditional African science that Akpan made reveals that the method of African science has been condemned to be purely superstitious, esoteric, mystically, and religiously inclined. This is indeed a one-sided perspective to the general outlook on traditional African science. Akpan affirms that there is an empirical evaluative procedure in traditional African science that complements the mystical religious method. This is the position which amplifies the idea that there are good elements in this established method of traditional African science that can serve as complementary to modern science. Nevertheless, one of the challenges that traditional African science faces, according to Akpan, is the lack of an attitude of free inquiry and openness of mind to criticism. Akpan's claim is that the traditional African scientist has not moved beyond the level of personalization and esotericization of knowledge. This claim also concerns the inability of the traditional African scientists to rationally explain their phenomenon and show how they arrived at their scientific conclusions. That can be a problem, and that's something that we as a people, as a group, would have to kind of, we'll have to kind of set some type of standard, right? In Western science, it's peer review, it's peer review science, it's being able to reproduce your results. Like when I was in the research lab, it was common for us to, for the PI to find these interesting, quote unquote, interesting papers on this interesting phenomenon some lab claimed they found, and for us to set up, according to the publication, to set up the exact experiment, right, using the same controls and controlled variables and whatnot, and not being able to reproduce the work. This is why I talked about all the fraud that happens in Western science. Right? You would have to have a way to back up these claims to make it worthwhile. Right? There would have to be a way. These are claims which connote that the method that the traditional African scientists employ is shrouded in secrecy to the extent that their knowledge of science is not displayed in the public sphere. So that's a good point being made. I'm going to make another point too later on, after I finish this, but that is actually a good point, right? If you're not able to reproduce the results, right, we have to have some kind of standard for that, right? Granted that what all scientists do, including the traditional African scientists, is to advance new ways to think about the nature of science. Scientists research about the nature of cosmology and whether the world is deterministic. They consider the differences between what is certain and probability is. They also research further on the meaning of quantum mechanics and medically about the well-being of society. No doubt, all such endeavors may require that one is involved in personalization or impersonalization of knowledge. This can be buttressed by the fact that what personalization of knowledge in science is refers to the label that science is simply just what a scientist does. Science here refers to the sum of what individual scientists do. This was a fundamental feature of Western science during what could be referred to as the heroic period in science. This was the period of eponymy as a prize in science, right? It was the period which recognized that what science really is just what the scientist does, who discovers some eponymous law or effect or anomaly or reaction. So the personalization of knowledge in traditional African science also suggests that the great amount of knowledge that the individual scientist acquires would be for their individual glory, if there is a prize of eponymy to be given, as well as for the benefit of society. Besides, it is wrong to assume that all traditional African scientists are involved in personalization of knowledge, as much as it is wrong to assume that Western science can rationally or justifiably explain all phenomena. Isaac Newton's inability to explain what he called action at distance is classical physics. In classical physics is a case in point, right? On the issue of putting knowledge to public scrutiny and criticism, it is pertinent to note that as much as every element of human thinking should be open to potential criticism, as Popper believed, one should be wary of criticisms that could pose a potential threat to the furthering of knowledge. Let it be clear that I agree with Popper that one should dispatch a formally received way of thinking or invent a bold new form of theoretical thought. Popper, however, professed the need to be cautious in action. Ambitions that are utopian or revolutionary seem to Popper always unacceptable. We must always be open to reforming our practices, but we must attempt this slowly and piecemeal. Every change that we make, we must hold open to criticism. It should always remain possible for us to judge that some past reform of ours was a misstep. So, on the criticism that the method of traditional African science is usually not made open for public scrutiny, it can be argued that outcomes of technical knowledge with inherent commercial values, both for the individual scientist and for the good of society, often require a certain level of caution. This may be necessary against bastardization and distortion of the core elements of the knowledge concerned. As such, it may require a certain level of technical and educational expertise or some legal backing for the knowledge to be made open. This is also a practice in Western science with what is known as protective attitude of knowledge, as can be found in the idea of patency. Following the above, the expectation that traditional African science should take a cue from the Western science method of rigorous theorization, which results in impersonalization, esotericization, and non-veneration of inexplicable authorities, is misplaced. the inevitability of metaphysics and perhaps the ontological relevance of the principle of causality in science must be re-emphasized. What characterizes traditional African science method is the embrace of both empirical and non-empirical procedures of knowledge. This case is strong, and I rehearse the argument that there are perhaps some finitude which are difficult to be proved by mere observational or experimental procedures, yet we believe tenaciously that they exist. In some cases, mere observation or even empirical experimentation of hypothesis does not give us the full knowledge of the physical universe. There are instances where we have to employ some extra empirical categories in interpreting what is given to us by our sense data. A fascinating example for this is the way some patients are often advised in formal hospitals to seek extra empirical categories in the diagnosis of their ailments when X-rays, laboratory tests, and MMR scans fail to detect or determine the nature of such ailments. Many of such cases abound and testimonials are verifiable. Successful employments of non-empirical means to diagnose patients which are able to determine the nature of the ailments have also been recorded in the annals of traditional African science. The non-empirical causal method of traditional African science is no doubt metaphysical and can also be mystic, religious, and in fact magical, as defined by Emedolo in From Magic to African Experimental Science Toward a New Paradigm. Emedolo's thesis is that a magical tradition existed while experimental science flourished in the West. Magic aided the development of science in the West. It is therefore not out of place when the method of African science is said to be laden with spiritism and religious mythological entities that must be engaged through invocation. So granted that when African science engages with granted that what African science engages with are the three different entities in the universe, such entities as matter, antimatter, and non-matter. African science is by no means devoid of rigorous process. There are mechanisms for peer review among practitioners, but that's good to know, right? In such a way that regulate their practices as well as the way it helps in knowledge sharing among themselves. There are also some elements of mentorship, which most often is knowledge taught to their offspring or outsiders who are willing to learn. The importance that governments in sub-Saharan Africa region now place on traditional medicine is indicative that the methods of traditional African science is acceptable as a complement to modern Western medicine of the formal setting. There have also been calls for the inclusion of African science into the school curriculum of some Western educational institutions, as presented by Brian Murfin, right? I don't know if Brian Murfin is a European, but sounds like a European, and there you go. Europeans and all are calling for African science to be in their curriculum, and I would guess it's because they realize the limitations to their own work, right? To their own methodology. And that's the end of the paper, right? That's the end of that paper. Kevin Carre 42 says, if these high IQ people are so smart, why do they have de Blasio bribing you with fries and hamburgers or ham birders, Trump word, to get the inoculation, right? And he provides a video you guys could check out. Dorico Cooper Photography says pink dolphins and space suits made of melanin. Wow, interesting and damn all this, and interesting and damn all at the same time. I'm not sure what Dorico's talking about. Pink dolphins and space suits made of melanin. Wow, interesting and damn all at the same time. I'm not sure where the pink dolphins came from and the melanin spacesuits, although that sounds interesting, right? How much is melanin these days? It's still like $600 an ounce or something like that? How much is melanin? I know it was worth more than gold, which is crazy, right? But how much is melanin these days? But yeah, that's the paper. And I know it's a, you know, you could say it's a scientific paper, scientific jargon, but I think you guys could follow along with what the paper is saying. And I think I connected the dot to, you know, thoughts I've had prior on this show, which is Africanize. In fact, forget that Africanized thing, because I don't want people to take it as we got to Africanize Western thought. No, go back to what we did before and build upon it, right? I want to make a point too that, you know, I knock the black researchers for doing research in areas that don't have a direct effect or a direct impact on African people, right? Their research and all this other shit, right? Now, to be clear and to be fair, Derico Cooper says $511 a gram for melanin, right? Now, to be clear and to be fair, the black person who is researching and who's looking to get funding from the NIH and all that type of stuff, they won't be able to make, they won't be able to get grants if they were to go that route, right? But again, that's the problem of doing the work in America, right? You gotta abide by their rules. If you want money to keep your lab up and employ some people and pay yourself, you gotta do the work that they care about. They don't care about African issues. But what I will say, I'm still going to come back and condemn them a little bit, because, listen, you go and you get your education, you get your skills or whatever, you have a lab, you have equipment that you're getting paid for by the NIH and all this stuff. On the side, you and other black researchers can be doing the pertinent work, right? So the work that you're doing with the equipment that you're being funded through the NIH and all that kind of stuff, you can still do the work that I have previously described. So I'm not letting them off the hook, but I have to put that out there that they cannot write a grant based on, you know, African science and HIV or something. They just won't get funding for that. Not in America. But the hopes would be that they could go to Africa and get funding for that work. And that's something Africa needs to get serious about. Africa needs to get serious about research and development. Tertiary education, mentorship, research and development. Africa has to get serious about that. That's how you're going to solve a lot of these problems. About a year ago, I did an episode where I was talking about photosynthesis. And I was talking about how understanding the basic idea of photosynthesis, if you build upon it, you can feed Africa. Africa has all these people suffering from malnutrition. They're importing rice from Asia when Africa has its own cultivar of rice, right? If you understand photosynthesis, you understand how photosynthesis can increase the biomass of the production of rice that you have going on currently. That's you fixing your own problems. That's you understanding your own problems and fixing your own problems on your own terms, right? So that's what we got to get to. If you think you're going to go through and get a Ph.D. in America and then go in this academia or in R&D somewhere, and you think you're going to write grants about the key component in the graviola fruit seed, right? Soursop seed. In terms of the mechanisms of cancer or whatever, P53 gene or whatever, you're lying to yourself. It's not going to happen, right? But what I would expect from you with that history of education, with the funding, with the fact that you have your own lab, you have your own equipment, I really would expect you to do some side work, you know, that focuses on issues that we have. It's not stuff that you're going to necessarily publish, but it's stuff that you can pass along in scientific notes to other Black scientists who can get in on the work. And I'm telling you, if that was happening, we would see a difference scientifically, medically, environmentally. We would see a difference in the Black situation. Sadly, that's not the case. I want to thank all of you who are here today, taking in this episode with me. Kevin Carre 42 was here. Drika Cooper Photography was here. Thanks for coming through. I know you have some situations going on, so thank you for coming through. Who else? NYC Beauties was here. Black Excellence was here. A Pretty Monotheism's Family of Dragon Tamers was here. Make sure to like and subscribe. Click the bell to be notified when I'm on again. And usually I'm on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I don't know what time that is where you are, but you can figure that out. Who else was here? Daily Affirmations by Pauline was here. Who else? Jerry Wallace was here. Life with Nelly was here. Teetums was here. Everyday NYC, this was their first day here. They were here. Revolutionary Matron was here. You know, NYC Sports Archive, Sankofa Knowledge. You know, I think I got everyone there, and if I didn't, I apologize. But yeah, I mean, you guys were here. I appreciate you. And I will see you for the Saturday night Shoot the Breeze episode, all right? You guys be cool. I think I might go on the Discord for a minute. So if you guys want to jump on the Discord, go to the lounge. I think I might go there for a little bit. But until next time, you guys be good. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.